They fully expected me to scream and fight when they cut me out. Honestly, they were prepared for a messy, emotional battle, the exact kind of family drama they seemed to thrive on. What they weren't ready for was the quiet, methodical dismantling of everything they held dear. This is the story of how I used their own greed against them and watched as they orchestrated their own downfall. And it all started with a single piece of information I let slip. It technically all kicked off 10 years ago, at the reading of my grandfather's will. But the real story, the one that matters, began long before that, in the heart of a business that was built on integrity, a value my family had long since forgotten. My grandfather, Arthur Carver, was a man carved from oak. He built Carver and Sons Manufacturing with his bare hands and a moral compass that never wavered. For him, a handshake was a binding contract, and your word was your bond. I spent my childhood summers in his workshop, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. He taught me the business from the ground up, the weight of the materials, the hum of the machinery, and most importantly, that profit should be the byproduct of excellence, not the goal itself. My Aunt Karen and Uncle Mark saw things differently. To them, Carver and Sons wasn't a legacy, it was an ATM. They just drifted in and out of the business, holding impressive-sounding titles, but contributing little more than expenses. They saw my grandfather's old-fashioned principles as a quaint little obstacle to maximizing their inheritance. While I was learning about supply chains and employee relations, they were learning about loopholes and offshore accounts. As my grandfather's health started to fail, their visits became more frequent, their smiles wider, their concern more staged. They weren't there to comfort a dying man. They were vultures circling, just waiting for the feast to begin. I'd watch them whispering in corners, their conversations immediately stopping the moment I entered a room. They saw my quiet devotion to my grandfather not as love, but as a threat to their plans. They convinced themselves that because I didn't demand a seat at the head of the table, I didn't deserve one. And that was their first mistake. The day of the will reading felt like a scene from a bad play. We were all gathered in some stuffy lawyer's office, the air thick with fake solemnity. Aunt Karen was in black, dabbing at her bone-dry eyes with a tissue. Uncle Mark was just staring at the polished mahogany table like he was calculating its worth. I just sat there, bracing myself for what I knew was coming. The lawyer cleared his throat and started reading. He talked about my grandfather's wishes, his love for his family, his pride in his company. And then the bombshell, a codicil, a last-minute amendment to the will, signed just 3 weeks before he passed. In it, my grandfather's entire estate, the company, the properties, the investments, was to be divided equally between Karen and Mark. And me? I got a small wooden box. Inside were my grandfather's first set of woodworking tools and a handwritten note that just said, "Build something that lasts." Karen placed a cold hand on my arm. "We're so sorry," she said, her voice dripping with phony sympathy. "He just wanted the business to be run by serious people. You understand." Mark chimed in, "It's a huge burden, really. We're doing this to protect his legacy. And you." They were gaslighting me, trying to rewrite history in real time to paint their greed as some kind of noble act. They were waiting for me to break down, to argue, to give them the messy, dramatic scene they wanted. I didn't do any of it. I just nodded, picked up my wooden box, and walked out of the room without another word. In the silence of that office, they heard my quiet as weakness. They didn't realize it was the sound of a 10-year war being silently declared. Have you ever been underestimated by the people who should know you best? Let me know in the comments below. It's a feeling I know all too well, and it can be a powerful motivator. For the next decade, I played the part they gave me. I was the forgotten nephew, the quiet one who moved on. I'd go to holiday dinners, smile politely, and listen to them brag about the company's modernization. They talk about aggressive expansion and clever new financial strategies, totally oblivious to the fact that I understood every single veiled term they used. To them, I was just living a simple life, working a modest job and keeping to myself. In reality, my life was anything but simple. My quiet was a shield. Behind it, I was building a case. My revenge was never going to be a single, explosive event. It was going to be death by 1,000 cuts, and they were going to hold the knives themselves. My first move was to attack the one thing holding their alliance together: greed. An alliance built on greed doesn't have a foundation. It's just a house of cards resting on a bed of suspicion. All it needed was a gentle breeze of doubt. I started small. An anonymous email found its way to Uncle Mark's inbox. It was vague, just a spreadsheet fragment showing unusually high consulting fees being paid to a shell corporation. A corporation that, if you dug just a little, could be loosely traced back to Karen's husband. I didn't make any accusations. I just sent the data, just enough to plant a seed. A few weeks later, a misdirected invoice was mailed to the company's accounting department. It detailed some very extravagant expenses for a business development trip to the Cayman Islands that only Mark and his new, much younger assistant had attended. The invoice was a complete fabrication, of course, but it looked real. I knew Karen reviewed the high-level expense reports. She would see it. The effect was almost immediate. At the next family dinner, the air was electric with unspoken accusations. Mark would make a passive-aggressive comment about everyone needing to pull their weight, while staring right at Karen. Karen would shoot back a sharp remark about maintaining a professional appearance and glance at Mark's flashy new watch. They were so used to their own deceit that they never suspected an outside force. They immediately believed the worst of each other because they knew exactly what the other was capable of. I was turning them against each other, and it was working perfectly. While they were busy pointing fingers at each other, I was busy compiling the truth. My family had made a second, critical mistake. They underestimated how much I'd been paying attention. But more importantly, they underestimated my grandfather. Years before he passed, in a moment of rare, unguarded clarity, my grandfather took me to a dusty, forgotten storage room behind his old office. If they ever burn this place to the ground for the insurance money, he'd said with a grim smile, the real story will be in here. Inside were rows of filing cabinets filled with the company's original ledgers, contracts, and letters, going all the way back to its founding. It was a complete, unfiltered history of Carver and Sons, from before the creative accounting and the digital shredders. My grandfather, ever the prudent man, had kept a perfect paper trail. He knew exactly who his children were, and he had left me a weapon. For 10 years, I gave up my weekends to that archive. I scanned every document, cross-referenced every transaction, and built a private database that told the company's true story. I saw how the small sins from the early years, minor skimming, padded expense reports, blew up into major crimes after my grandfather's death. They weren't just running the company, they were gutting it from the inside out, bleeding it dry while putting on a show of profitability. I had every transfer, every email, every hidden conversation. I knew which government contracts were secured with gifts, which safety regulations were ignored, and which environmental reports were faked. They were sitting on a powder keg, and I had the match. But I wasn't just going to light it. I was going to get them to do it for me. After a decade of quiet preparation, the time was right. The paranoia between Karen and Mark was at an all-time high. The company was over-leveraged, and their lavish lifestyles were being funded by debt disguised as assets. The house of cards was wobbling. I didn't want to sue them. A lawsuit would be messy, expensive, and could drag on for years, giving them time to hide what was left. I wanted a public reckoning. I wanted their downfall to be swift, brutal, and entirely self-inflicted. I spent months researching journalists. I wasn't looking for a mainstream reporter. I was looking for a shark. I found one in a guy named David Chen, an ambitious freelance journalist with a reputation for sinking his teeth into corporate corruption and never letting go. He had a small but influential blog and a real knack for getting his stories picked up by major outlets. Using a public library computer and an anonymous email address, I sent him a message. I didn't dump all the data on him. A flood of information would just be overwhelming and suspicious. Instead, I gave him a single, perfect thread to pull on. That thread was Aunt Karen's pet project, her husband's failed luxury car dealership. It had been secretly financed with over $2 million from Carver and Sons, funneled through the marketing department as an experiential brand partnership. It was brazen, easily verifiable, and deliciously sleazy. I attached just a handful of curated documents, the internal transfer request signed by Karen, a doctored marketing proposal, and an email from her husband complaining that the funding was late. It was just enough. It was irrefutable, scandalous, and the perfect entry point into a much larger story of rot. I hit send and walked away. The fuse was lit. 2 weeks later, the article dropped. David Chen had done his job. The headline was a work of art, The Carver Legacy, How a Patriarch's Dream Became a Family's Free-for-All. The story was devastating. It laid out, in meticulous detail, how Karen had embezzled company funds for her husband's vanity project. But Chen didn't stop there. That one thread had led him to others. He'd uncovered the trip to the Cayman Islands, hinting at tax avoidance schemes. He'd spoken to disgruntled former employees who were all too happy to talk about the toxic, cutthroat culture Karen and Mark had created. The fallout wasn't gradual. It was a detonation. The story, with its crystal-clear evidence of financial misconduct, got picked up by a national business journal. The mention of potential tax evasion in the Cayman Islands was like a homing beacon for the IRS, which, spurred on by the public scandal, immediately launched a full-scale audit. But the final nail in the coffin was a call from their largest corporate partner. My grandfather had built a morality clause into that original contract decades ago, a clause they had completely forgotten about. The public scandal gave the partner the legal right to terminate their agreement immediately. With that one phone call, nearly 40% of Carver and Sons' revenue vanished overnight. Panic erupted. The shaky alliance between Karen and Mark didn't just crack, it vaporized. Karen, trying to save herself, publicly accused Mark of financial recklessness, using the fake invoice I had sent years ago as proof of his long-standing deceit. Mark retaliated by leaking documents to the press that showed Karen's history of siphoning funds, confirming the journalist's story and making himself look complicit in the process. They were tearing each other apart in the public square, doing my work for me with a ferocity I could never have matched. A month later, I asked them to meet me. I chose a neutral spot, a small, quiet coffee shop. They showed up separately, looking haggard and defeated. The designer clothes were wrinkled, the confident smirks replaced with the gaunt, haunted look of people who have lost everything. They expected me to gloat. They were probably ready for me to demand a payout, a final piece of the carcass they were still fighting over. Karen spoke first, her voice raspy. "What do you want? Is this what this was all about? Money?" I took a slow sip of my coffee and looked at them both. For the first time, I didn't see monsters. I just saw two small, pathetic people, shrunken by their own greed. "You were right, all those years ago," I said quietly. "I wasn't serious enough to run the company your way. I let that hang in the air. My grandfather taught me that integrity was the foundation of his business. He said it was the only thing that truly lasts. You sold that foundation for parts. You looted his legacy for cars and vacations and fancy watches. And for what? Look at you." I leaned forward a little. "I never wanted the money. I just wanted the truth to come out. The fact that I want nothing from you now, that should be the most terrifying thing you've ever heard." They just stared at me, dumbfounded. The idea that my actions weren't motivated by money was a concept their minds just couldn't process. There was no screaming, no grand confrontation. Just the quiet, crushing weight of their own actions. I paid for my coffee and walked out, leaving them to sit in the ruins they had built for themselves. In the end, Carver and Sons was sold for pennies on the dollar to a competitor, just to cover the mountain of debts and legal fees. The family name was ruined. Karen and Mark lost everything, the company, their reputations, and each other. Their greed had finally consumed itself. And what about me? And that small wooden box my grandfather left me? After the will reading, I sold those antique tools to a collector. It wasn't a fortune, but I invested it. I put it into small, well-run companies, the kind of businesses my grandfather would have admired, built on integrity and a good product. Over the past 10 years, I nurtured that small investment, and it grew. I built something that lasts. Not a corporate empire built on a rotten foundation, but a life of my own, free from their poison. They taught me a valuable lesson. Respect isn't given to those who take. It's earned by those who stand their ground. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stay quiet and let people's own greed orchestrate their downfall. If you enjoy stories about quiet strength and calculated justice, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next.